I'd like to welcome each of you here this Sabbath, and we are ready again to continue on this little series we have going here. Does anyone remember what we've been talking about? No? The end from the beginning. I saw you read the slide. Okay, that's called cheating, where I come from. But anyways, yes, that's a good way to do it, declaring the end from the beginning. And we have been talking quite a bit about that, how God has declared the end from the beginning. So the beginning of time, we've gone over that, the first promise in Genesis 3:15, where God would actually, it was an abbreviated statement, but the plan was that eventually everything would revert back to the Garden of Eden. And all things that Yeshua spoke about, all things would be restored. And that's the kingdom. That includes the kingdom, the ways of the kingdom, and so on. And when Yeshua came, he came preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And that came in different forms. He came living the life of what the people are going to be like in the kingdom. He showed us how to live in kingdom terms. He also gave us lots of parables that explained what it's going to be like in the kingdom, what the people are going to be like. And we've talked about humility. Does anyone remember that we talked about humility? That's what we have to possess in order to get into the kingdom. When we realize that the world doesn't revolve around us, that's the first sign in my mind that a person is starting to be renewed. And we always have to remember that every day, every minute of the day. Some of us, myself included, is the world doesn't revolve around us, and just because things aren't going right for us, it doesn't mean that it's everyone else's problem. It might be something that we have to deal with. So, okay, so that's kind of what we've been covering. Last week we talked about the kingdom restored and what that's going to be like, and the curse being removed and so on. And we're going to go a little more into that today. So this is kind of an extension because we didn't finish. And we're talking a little bit earlier. Is the gospel actually, it's called the everlasting gospel. And that's because I believe the good news that God has for us is not going to be over when he comes a second time, nor will it be over at the end of the millennium, but the gospel is everlasting. We're going to be learning things and experience things that are going to be everlasting goodness, which is the good news that we're going to experience all through eternity. This idea of sitting on a cloud somewhere and playing a harp forever, I don't know. I'm just not turned on to that. I mean, I wouldn't mind learning how to play a harp, but I got more to do than play a harp. I don't know about you. Does anyone else relate to that? Yeah, we see commercials sitting on harp or sitting on clouds and playing harps and eating cheese. Have you ever seen those commercials? I don't know. I don't think that's what we're going to be doing. But anyways, so let's continue on. We're going to find out some things today. Some of these things you may know already. But kind of like Peter, he says it's good to go over this stuff now and again. And it refreshes it in our minds, keeps it sort of fresh and alive, and gives us energy, actually. So before we start, let's have a word of prayer so that we can get some guidance from the Spirit. And we've been talking about the spirit of prophecy, and maybe we'll talk a little more about this. We had some questions come in about the spirit of prophecy, and I might just pick up that question before we start here. Father in heaven, we thank you again for your word that is sure. Your word declares that you cannot lie, and you have made some very, very wonderful promises for us to look forward to. And we're going to go over them, some of them today. We ask that you be with us. We ask that your Spirit lead us and guide us. We pray in Yeshua's name. Amen. So we had a question come in on the spirit of prophecy. And of course, a lot of the things that we're doing that we're talking about have to do with prophecy. The gospel is a prophecy, isn't it? It's a prophecy in the Old Testament, the first 4,000 years. It was a prophecy, all the renewing in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and a lot of the prophets, they talked about a kingdom that would come. And then New Testament comes along, the days of Yeshua. When he came to dwell amongst us, he showed us what we're going to be like, those that are going to be a part of the kingdom. And he died. He died that death that we deserved so that we could have that life that he actually deserved, and we would have eternal life through his sacrifice that he made. So the whole 4,000 years was prophetic, as it were, until Yeshua came. Then he gave some more prophecies in the book of Revelation that put some more icing on that prophetic cake, if you will, and made it look even better when we got to the book of Revelation. And once we understand the book of Revelation, the Revelation is a lot of good news as well, and that's just what the gospel is. So we're going to be looking a little more at the book of Revelation. But before we do that, we had a question come in, and if I can just remember clearly what the question was you talk a lot about the spirit of prophecy. What or who is the spirit of prophecy? And I found that to be a very interesting question, because there seems to be some confusion of what or who the spirit of prophecy is. The spirit of prophecy actually is the spirit of truth. Yeshua said himself, he said, when he, the Spirit, comes, he will guide you into all truth and show you things to come. That's prophecy. So the spirit of prophecy is that comforter that was to come, which I believe to be the spirit of Yeshua. It says in the book of Revelation, right in the beginning of the book of Revelation, it says that Yeshua gave something to John, and it was called the testimony of Yeshua. He gave the testimony of Yeshua to John. There was an angel go-between. So it went from the Father, verses 1 through 3 in Revelation chapter 1. Says that God gave this message to Yeshua, who gave it to his angel, who gave it to John, and John was to give it to the churches. So we are part of the churches. So we have this gift. It's called the testimony of Yeshua. We read in Revelation, we see that again in chapter 14, later on the end of chapter 14. It says that they keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Yeshua. Chapter 19, verse 10, I believe there's a prophet that appears in front of John that he says, the prophet says, and it's a prophet that was in heaven. So that's an interesting concept. We're going to be looking at some of those ideas in this study. But this prophet says to John that the testimony of Yeshua is the spirit of prophecy. So there's a gift given to the church, given to the last day church. It's called the gift of prophecy, and it's given through the spirit of prophecy, which is the testimony of Yeshua, which is the word of Yeshua, which is Yeshua himself giving his testimony to the church, which is through the spirit of prophecy, being Yeshua himself. Did I confuse everyone in that, or does that actually make sense? So if the spirit of prophecy was a person, it's the spirit of Yeshua that's gone out to give revelation of what's going to come and the gospel. It's a revelation of the gospel, actually. And the gospel is what? Somebody give me a word, 2 words that is the gospel. Good news. That's all it is. And it's kind of frustrating. It's just one of those little things that the gospel writers, I don't know, when I'm reading a book, if it's the book is in English, let's just keep all the words in English. You know, it just kind of makes more sense to me. I just read it for what it is. Sometimes it's good to have the Hebrew of what the word means so I can get a deeper meaning and so on. But it talks about the gospel of Yeshua. It's actually the good news of Yeshua. That's really what the gospel means. And once we understand the gospel, it truly is good news. I'm going to make you guys work a little bit before we get started. I want you to turn to Romans chapter 1. Could you do that for me? I know it's been pretty easy. I've just had the text up on the board, and it's been so easy for everyone. We're going to make you work for it because you're not going to have these PowerPoints when you're sharing this stuff. So we're talking about the gospel. I find today that there's a lot of people confused on what the gospel is. And somebody might say, well, you're pretty confused about what the gospel is. I guess really the reality of it is we're all coming to grips with what the gospel is. The gospel, the beginning of the gospel really is the good news that Yeshua has died for us. Is that good news? Is that good news? Yes, that's really good news. And a lot of people stop there, and that's all they talk about. But that's only the beginning, really, of the good news, because that his death makes it so that we can enjoy the eternal gospel, the good news of eternity. So that's really, but the gospel of the kingdom that Yeshua preached about was a kingdom that would be restored. And of course, the only way we can get to that kingdom is through him and what he's done for us. But I just want to pick up what Paul says here. Very interesting in chapter 1, verse 15 of Romans. And Romans is known as the gospel according to Paul because he really gets into it. And of course, these are people, these are Gentiles, primarily Gentiles he's talking to here in Rome. It says, so as much as is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also. So what do you get out of that? Well, it says what it says, but there's one word there that I find kind of interesting. It sort of sets the pace of what Paul has been doing. What does it say? Preaching the gospel. But there's one word, one little word, four-letter word. Also. So what does that tell you?
He's in Rome too.
He's in Rome, but also he's preaching the gospel to them also. So doesn't that mean he's preaching the gospel to other people? Paul's focus as an evangelist traveling around was to preach the gospel. That was his sole purpose in his life, was to preach the gospel. And in Paul's mind, when you look at all of his books, the book of Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and all of those things, they all have little spatterings of the gospel. Because if you were to preach the gospel and contain everything that the gospel contains, that'd be a pretty big book. In fact, there it is. So each place he went to, he preached the gospel, but he preached different aspects of the gospel. The book of Ephesians, very interesting, shows how he's going to bring Gentiles and the Israelites together, the Israelites believers together, and create one body. So that's just one of the parts of the gospel. That's to create one family in heaven. Then he goes on to Ephesians a little bit later in chapter 3, and then he says he's going to take that one family, once that's all together, which is being done right now, and he's going to unite that family with his family in heaven. That's part of the gospel. So that's an aspect of the gospel that a lot of people leave off. But to me, that's an incredible part of the gospel, because this earth is only part of the gospel. The gospel contains things that we have no idea what's out there in the heavens, the principalities and powers in heavenly places. So this is all part of the gospel that Paul was preaching. So he goes on to say in verse 16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, or the good news of Yeshua, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, first for the Jew and also the Greek. Now that's packed. Again, that is packed. So he's not ashamed of the gospel. Why isn't he ashamed of the gospel? He says in another place that he counts everything as dung as compared to what God has for us. So now tell me why he's not ashamed of the gospel. Because nothing else mattered to him. Nothing. He was completely consumed in the gospel of Yeshua. The restoration of all things made new. And that's what we've been talking about. That's what we really started focusing in on last week, and we're going to pick it up again because this is all the gospel. So it's the power of God. How is it? Somebody explain to me out there in internet land or wherever, if you've got the answer to this question, if we don't come up with it today, I would love to have an email and explain this to me. How is the gospel the power of God? I'm looking at you guys. I'm looking at the camera. How is the gospel the power of God? Great question. What is the power of God? Do we need the power of God? Do we need the power of God in our lives? Why do we need the power of God in our lives? Because we can't do what we're supposed to do on our own. I will put a new spirit within you, and he will cause you to walk in my statutes and judgments. Have you ever tried being obedient to God without the Spirit? Now, I know no one here has. But don't we find ourselves once in a while, we're doing it all by ourselves? How does that go for you? It's a little frustrating? Just anger maybe sometimes? No. Okay, so let's get back to the question. How is the gospel the power of God? Okay.
Well, Yeshua was an overcomer.
Yeshua was an overcomer.
He modeled overcoming. So, because he lived a perfect life, it gives us strength to.
Okay, Yeshua lived a perfect life. He was an overcomer, and he gives us strength. Okay, you're starting it.
And there's a text for that. 1 Corinthians 1:24, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God.
Okay, now you've entered something else into that, the wisdom of God. We're getting there. Okay, how is the gospel the power of God? I saw your hand. These aren't trick questions. These are questions, and I know you're just shy and you don't want to say because you don't want to get the wrong answer. All these answers are right, by the way.
Yeshua says, I can do nothing but through the Father.
Okay, Yeshua said, I can do nothing except through the Father. I do nothing of myself except the Father shows me. Right? Okay, that's absolutely part of it. It's absolutely part of it. You guys all know we just haven't put this together, and I think it's really important to put it together. And here's why. Because when we start to put this together, we start to understand what the gospel is and the purpose of it. Now, it's good news. Now, if you had a newspaper, if I gave you a newspaper and the front page had news on it, and it was bad news, how would that change your day? You might get grumpy that day, right? It might put you into a bad mood, especially if some of it affected you. You know, you're a rich person, you have lots of money, and right on the front page it says, stock market crash today. Oh, wonderful. Are you going to have a good day? What do you think? The gospel, the good news of the gospel is going to change the way we think. That's what it is. It changes the way we think. When we have a bad day, we remember the gospel and the good news of the gospel, and it will pick us up. Has anyone ever experienced that? I experience that all the time. Now, I guess I've just given you a secret. I have bad days all the time. But when we have a bad day, the gospel is the power of God to lift us out of the ditches that we're in. Now that to me is good news. That's why it's all so wonderful. And I say to people, it's kind of like God putting a carrot. Have you seen those pictures of a donkey with a carrot out front and it just keeps marching? That's kind of what the gospel is. We keep moving forward. And this is the neatest thing in my mind about the gospel is a progressive revelation of the goodness that you said and the wisdom of God. So as we're moving forward in the gospel, chasing it, if you will, experiencing the power of it, as we move forward in the gospel, we're going to get fresh revelations of the righteousness and the wisdom of God. Now, there's power in that. It has the power to change your life. A lot of people think that the power of the gospel is God holds a little wand over us and he gives us the Spirit, and we just all of a sudden we can do all these things, leap tall buildings with a single bound and this kind of thing, walk through walls. That's really not what the gospel is. The gospel is the power of God that gets into our brain and it changes the way we think. And if we change the way we think, it comes out in what we do and what we say and how we act and so on. It changes us into the kind of people that we can be ready for the kingdom. Is this making any sense to anyone out there? Sure. So, this now becomes very important that we understand the true gospel, because there's other gospels. Paul talked about other gospels and people preaching another gospel. This is what we're dealing with here at the end of time, is we got lots of gospels out there. What's the true? How do you know the true gospel? How do you know what I'm saying is the true gospel? Can somebody please help me on that one? How do you know this? Somebody out there in internet land says, well, I know you're not preaching the gospel. I don't know what the gospel is, but I know you're not preaching it. This is like, oh, my. You know it by being good Bereans. You know it by being good Bereans, by studying the Word. There's one other way to know. And this is the tricky one, and I keep coming back to this one because it's really, really important, is that you know the voice of the shepherd, the true shepherd. There's lots of shepherds out there, but there's lots of false shepherds, and Yeshua warned us about this. Don't be deceived, even if the elect be deceived. In John chapter 10, he talks about the false shepherds, that they really don't care about the sheep. They're just taking care of themselves. And when trouble comes, they're gone. They're out of here and leave the sheep to themselves and so on. So it's very important to understand who the true shepherd is. And this is where it gets a little tricky, but if you stick with it, it's not tricky, because you can tell the true shepherd is because everything that he does, and we follow him through the Gospels, he had a record. He had a perfect record. Everything that he did was righteous. So if you're listening to somebody and something doesn't make sense and it doesn't seem righteous, we talked about one of the things that didn't seem righteous last week. Now I'm going to test you. What was that one thing? There's one part of a gospel that people are preaching that is not righteous. And this is how you can measure it. This is always how you can measure something, whether it's righteous or not. Now, there was something that we talked about. I did a little bit of a demonstration. That should give it away. The everlasting fire, right? The fire that has an everlasting effect, if you will. That the wicked would be ashes under our feet. The idea that people are going to burn forever and ever, number one, that's going to require a miracle that can't happen now. People can't live in a fire forever. They can't. And so God would have to create a miracle where people could live forever in a fire. And they would be in torture forever in a fire. And that just doesn't make sense. Heaven would be hell for anyone that knew that their relatives, even their relatives just because they didn't choose Yeshua, were burning forever and ever. That would just not be right. So these are this is just a simple example as to a way we can measure something, because there's lots of ideas flowing out there that apparently have rooting in Scripture. And people are famous for taking one text and developing a whole theology around it, and so on. And we're going to look at some of this stuff as we get further down the road, and so on. But we want to look at here, it says, the gospel is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. So you got to believe it. If you don't believe the good news of what's coming, it's not going to give you any power. You have to believe it, and that affects your mind, and it changes your mind on how you act and react and so on. To first the Jew and then also the Greek. And at first the Jew, the reason is because Yeshua came unto his own, and his own received him not. He came there. So the gospel went out from Jerusalem to the world. That's what Yeshua said just before he left. He said, go first to Jerusalem, then to Judea, and then Samaria, and then the uttermost ends of the earth. So then it would go out to the Gentiles. Start at home first and have it go out from your home, as it were. For in the gospel, I'm going on, if you have your Bible open still, verse 17 of chapter 1 of Romans, for in it, that's the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. So this is what I'm saying. If somebody's telling you something that doesn't put a righteous reflection onto God, so a truth, somebody's truth, and I say that carefully, that wording is done carefully, somebody's truth. Somebody that believes something to be true, whether it's true or not, something that I believe, if it's not true, it's not going to be true just because I believe it, nor is it going to be truth the longer I believe it. So there's a lot of people teaching things that aren't truth, but they think it's truth. So this is what I'm trying to say is, one of the ways that we can tell if something's truth or not, if it's part of the gospel which reflects onto what God is like, it says that the gospel is the righteousness of God revealed. So if part of the gospel is people living in eternal flames, and that displays the righteousness of God, I have a real problem with that. That to me does not display the righteousness of God. It makes God out to be some sort of sadist that would keep people alive suffering eternally. I say that's something that developed in the mind of an enemy of God, to make God look bad. Would you agree with that? And so we have to critically analyze everything that people are teaching. Everything. Nothing can slip through the cracks of our minds, because what it does is everything that is part of the gospel goes into our mind, and it reflects on how we believe that God is. And so it's very important to get the gospel straight. Very important to get the gospel straight. So here we go. He goes on to say, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith unto faith. That's as we develop our idea about what the gospel is, as the gospel grows from faith to faith. When we first start, we have a little seed of what the gospel is, and that seed starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And Yeshua said that eventually that tree develops and it feeds birds and all kinds of things. And that's what the gospel is in ourselves. It starts to feed us after a while. And of course, we can feed others with the gospel when it grows up and comes to fruition in our own minds. In it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. And I like to emphasize this verse because a lot of people kind of get confused on this. This comes from Habakkuk 2, verse 4. The just shall live by faith. Those are those that believe the gospel, that they will live by faith. In other words, they will not live and grit their teeth with faith. They will live abundantly, like John says, that I have come that you would have life. Yeshua says, in John chapter 10, I think, that I have come that you would have life and have it more abundantly. Your life would be full of life through Yeshua. So we can live an abundant life by our faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So here you have it. This is also part of the gospel. Is that good news? Is this good news? This part of the gospel. It says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Is that good news? Come on. I'm getting yes and no. Depends which side of the fence you're on. And we're told it's life. The gospel is life to those that believe, but it's not life to those that are going to enter destruction. It condemns them. The gospel condemns them. So we want to be on the right side of that for sure. But the wrath of God upon sinners, when you think about it, it's actually good news because it's the destruction of all sin. And the beauty and part of the gospel is that the gospel of the kingdom is going to go to all the world. Everyone in the world is going to have opportunity to hear the gospel before the curtain closes, if you will. That's good news. That's the righteousness of God. He's not going to close the scenes before everyone has had a chance. Is that good news? Yes, that's good news. We can rest assured that God is going to give everyone an opportunity to hear what the truth is before he closes the door of opportunity for his kingdom. That's righteousness, isn't it? Isn't that a righteous God? Sure. So everything about the gospel should display the righteousness of God. So here we go here. I'm not ashamed. You're not ashamed, and I'm not ashamed to preach the gospel because it is the righteousness of God revealed for everyone who believes.